that he's reaching out to our Bell in an attempt to possibly help us change our future.
I've been on this world line since April of this year, and I plan to leave soon. Typically, time travelers do not purposefully affect the world lines they visit. However, this mission is unusually long, and I've grown attached to some of the people that I've met here. Anyway, for my own reasons, I've decided to help out the world line by sharing information about the future with a few people in the hope that it'll help their future. I'm contacting you for the same reason.
Perhaps this is what his grandfather was hoping for him to remember the love, get emotionally attached, and then decide to help our world line. Many people believe that because of his actions back in 1998,
Alrighty, oh, I just done messed with the cat. It's still wanting to go up, but I'm gonna try to put 2 lines of black on here, and then we're gonna wash it. Another thing, when you're doing your corners, you need to add more to the corner because of the way that it's doing and all. I don't get it. But anyway, let's get busy, and I hope you enjoy the video.
In 1975, in an undisclosed location in Rochester, Minnesota, a secret meeting took place. 2 men had a conversation, and ultimately, one man walked away with technology that would literally change the future. Hello, and welcome to Rope. If you like ideas about time travel, or you just want to know a little bit more about John Titor's time travel story, then stick with us, because we're going to share a never-heard-before linear version of John Titor's life. You've never heard John Titor shared like this. Many people have shared the John Titor story, but most of them do it from basically the same point of view, and they're really not all that interesting. They all state that it started with the mysterious facts to Art Bell in 1998. Then they give a few highlights of John's life. They talk about Civil War, mad cow disease, and World War III. And maybe they throw in a couple of tidbits that you haven't heard before, and then they all share the reasons why it's already been debunked. And after you've seen one of those videos, well, it's like you've seen them all. What hasn't been done yet is a video detailing John Titor's life from his birth to when he popped into our timeline to when he left. Someone claiming to be a time traveler from the future, John Titor, posted hundreds, maybe thousands of times on 2 different forums, and they did this for months. And during that time, he was asked all sorts of questions. And if someone were to comb through all of those posts, it would be easy to see that there's enough information there to completely formulate a very clear picture of this man's life. And well, you guys know Amy. She is relentless for this type of tedious work. So she went through every single one of John Titor's posts, and she reassembled them in a way as to detail his life in linear fashion. And when you're done watching this report, you'll know the entire John Titor story as told by John Titor himself. In this video, we're going to share the John Titor story. We're going to share his life, when and where he was born, how he grew up, and what his life was like as a child. We'll take you through all the major events in his life, when he first learned to fight, guerrilla style, when he joined the military, and why he was chosen to go back in time and save his world. We'll share the meeting that he had with his grandfather and how his grandfather just might have influenced him to come forward and contact Art Bell and change our world. During this report, we'll quickly touch on the Mandela effect, and we'll show why it just might add a tiny bit of validity to John's story. And then stay with us for our fact or fiction section. I'm going to take just a minute and look at a couple of the bigger reasons why most people feel that this story has already been debunked. And you just might be surprised to find out that their arguments really aren't all that strong. And then I'm going to share a sit-down that I had with Amy, our very first sit-down. Up until now, she had to video in from the other side of the house. But we finally put together a set for her to share her additional resources at the end of our videos. And I promise you, you're not going to want to miss this particular sit-down. What she has to say, it is mind-blowing. Believe it or not, during her research, she came across a lawsuit. And in this lawsuit, there was an object that quite possibly should not exist in our world line. And it seems to have just appeared in the year 1998. Right around the same time that Art Bell got that mysterious fax. So, the John Teeter story begins in Florida in the 1990s. To get a good idea of what life was like when John entered the world, one really needs to take a look at Florida in the 1990s. So what was that like? Florida always seems to be just a little too warm and a little too humid, and the late 90s was no exception. Hot days and warm nights seemed to prevail even through the thickest of cloud covers. Living near the ocean, people took advantage of the many beaches up and down the Florida coastline. Some say that the 90s was the last decade of innocence, with TV shows like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Seinfeld, and Friends. Great movies came out during that decade. There was The Titanic, Forrest Gump, and Jurassic Park. Then, in 1997, tragedy struck the world as everyone mourned the sudden passing of Princess Diana, and a car accident that many would later come to believe was a conspiracy to get rid of her. And in the very following year, in an unassuming single-family home, a child was born who would one day be chosen to travel back in time and save his world. John Teeter was born to a loving family in an upper-middle-class home somewhere between January 1st and February 2nd of 1998. He had a strong anchor in life with the support of those who loved him, giving him a solid upbringing. His family had strong views on education, so he was homeschooled, which allowed him to take advantage of an already above-average intelligence. Each year, his family would take a vacation, and his favorite vacation spot was Disney World, with Daytona Beach following up as a strong second. While he was still very young, his timeline diverged from ours. Political stresses within the United States began to rise, and although he couldn't quite understand the bigger picture just yet, he definitely felt the tension. Somehow, civil liberties were systematically being stripped away from the masses, and John's family became more and more reclusive because of it. They limited their time in public. They kept to themselves. They stayed indoors. Then, one evening in 2005, when John was just 7 years old, an unexpected pounding came from the front door, and John watched as his father answered it and was nearly trampled over by official-looking men with guns. The moment felt surreal as they aggressively stormed their way in, grouped everyone into one room, and then searched the house. As the family huddled together, John's father must have reassured them everything was gonna be okay. But this just might have been the very first time that John saw true fear in his father's eyes. And it's not at all clear that he truly believed that everything really was going to be okay. Either the men didn't find whatever it was they were looking for, or this was just some sort of intimidation tactic, because a short while later, they left the house and they did not take anything with them from their search. Unfortunately, not all of John's neighbors would be so lucky. After John's house was raided, tensions in the family were high. Everyone was on edge. And John, he couldn't help but be filled with anxiety every time that he heard a loud knock coming from the front door. And he watched from his window as his neighbors were also visited by those official-looking men with guns. Several of his neighbors seemed to have had the exact same experience that John's family did, where these men would show up, storm in, linger for a bit, and then leave empty-handed. But at least one of the families on his block wasn't so lucky, because during their raid, some of them were actually arrested and taken away. Shortly after that, John's father announced that the family was moving, and before John knew it, the car was packed and they were heading out of the city. From that day forward, John's life would never be the same. The family reestablished themselves in a small farming community in central Florida, and that was when John learned that the country had split into two. What a traumatic thing to learn at 7 years old. He was told that the people were on one side, and a tyrannical government who had retitled itself the American Federal Empire, or the AFE, was on the other. It was full-blown civil war. Americans were killing Americans, and John's family did its very best to stay out of the way. While the war raged for income, John traveled with his father up and down the Florida coastline, selling oranges and other supplies to newly formed communities. Doing this type of work during wartime was nerve-wracking, and occasionally John and his father would have to abandon their oranges and other supplies and run. Every once in a while, they would be forced to stop and to fight, which was never a good experience. Over the next few years, John got really good at running, hiding, and fighting. And then, hardened and seasoned, at just 13 years old, John joined a ragtag rebellion group of fighters, and that is when he learned what war really was. From right around 7 years old to 13 years old, John traveled with his father, selling oranges and other supplies to newly formed communities up and down the west side of the Florida coastline. But he also kept tabs on the war from a distance, and with each day that passed, he developed a stronger and stronger desire to jump in and do his part for freedom. Eventually, and unfortunately, at just 13 years old, he joined a group of freedom fighters called the Fighting Diamondbacks. Before joining, John thought that he had been involved in the war, but he quickly learned that running, hiding, and occasionally fighting isn't war. This was war, and he was thrust right smack dab into the very thick of things. And during this time is really when his character was developed and he would become the man that he was meant to be. Without getting into the details, John witnessed dozens of killings, and although we can't confirm this from John's online posts, we can extrapolate just by the nature of war itself that many of the people who died were John's comrades, and most likely his friends. He did post that he watched some of them being shot to death, some of them being burned to death, and in some cases, he could only stand by helplessly and watch as some of his friends slowly bled to death. It had to be one of the most horrific times in his life. Meanwhile, as John was going through the fire, so to speak, and becoming the man that he would soon be, scientists on the other side of the planet at CERN in Geneva had cranked up and turned on the largest atom smasher ever built. The LHC, or the Large Hadron Collider, came online and began slamming subatomic particles together. During one of its runs, something unexpected happened, and scientists made a major discovery about the nature of time travel, and other dimensions. Interestingly enough, people here in our timeline feel that something very similar happened here as well. Many people believe that when the Large Hadron Collider was cranked up, it somehow affected time. So much so that people all over the world experienced a shift in time. You may remember this as the Mandela effect. Now, here is the very interesting part about this. The Mandela effect, for us, here in our timeline, happened after 2007. And the information that we got from John Titor about this phenomenon was first mentioned in 1998, and then later in 2000. If John Titor was a hoax, then how did he know about the time shift effects that the Large Hadron Collider would soon create? That is a huge coincidence. Back in John's world, further studies into this strange time shift phenomenon at CERN would later allow scientists to develop the very mechanisms that would one day make time travel possible. But then, nuclear war would rearrange everything. While the United States was locked in this civil war, Russia was working behind the scenes, and they were formulating a plan to take advantage of a divided country. And in 2015, they launched nuclear missiles at America. Jacksonville, Florida was the very first city to get hit, and it was quickly followed by several others like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Over the next several hours, dozens of other cities were hit, and they were instantly polarized. The United States, of course, fired back, and for a half a day, the entire world was lit up like a Roman candle in a matchbox full of dynamite. And when the smoke cleared, well, 3 billion people had been evaporated from the surface of the planet, and the entire social, economic, and political landscape of the world was rearranged. The tyrannical government that John was fighting was gone. So was the European Union and the Chinese Communist Party. Shortly after the very last nuke took out its target, the war was over. Each country was just too busy trying to dig themselves out of the rubble to worry about continuing the fight. After the war, the world was a very different place. One where John, after a lifetime of living like a fugitive, could finally relax and spend some time with nature. Then, in 2029, he took advantage of a military-sponsored program, and he became a student at the University of Florida, and he graduated in 2034. Now, during this entire time, those scientists over at CERN had never stopped working on trying to understand and perfect time travel. And in the same year that John graduated college, 2034, and with the help of General Electric, believe it or not, the very first time machine was built. Once time travel had been firmly established, well, volunteers were needed to test and then travel through time. John heard about the program, and he applied, and he was accepted. John was among the very first to go through the training process, and he finished training in March of 2035, and immediately after that, he was ready for actual in-the-field time travel missions. And then, in April of the following year, he was chosen to jump back to 1975, grab a computer, and save his world. Why and how sending someone back in time would save the world, well, that's a bit complicated to explain. Basically, John's world was in a bind. Computers in his timeline were on the verge of crashing. It was a problem similar to the Y2K scare that we all went through here in our world. The difference was that in our world, we were able to do a couple of things early on to avoid it. But in John's world, that wasn't an option. And the solution to what they needed, believe it or not, could only be found in old computers that no longer existed. The nuclear war had destroyed every single model that had this solution inside it. Now, it may sound weird that a computer from the past could save and help the computers in the future, but believe it or not, there is a very solid and sound reason behind this. But it is too technical for our purposes, and it would only detract from our story, so we're not going to dive into it. However, if you feel like you really need a detailed description or explanation of this problem, then I recommend that you check out a video by Retro Recipes. He explains in detail why John's World needed this particular computer, and we'll put a link in the description below. In any case, John's World did indeed need one of these computers, but as I said, they had all been destroyed, and now they only existed in the past. But they did have a time machine, and it just so happened that John's grandfather had been involved in the very designing and programming of these computers.
So depending on the mission, time traveler is usually chosen for a particular mission based on their ability to gain cooperation of someone related to the goal of the target on the target world line. In my case, my grandfather was directly involved with the building and programming of 5100.
In John's online posts in those time travel forums, he said that he was in the Army. But he also said that he was stationed at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, and this is where he would be departing from. But his grandfather and the computer that he needed to get was in Rochester, Minnesota. John said that the trickiest parts of time travel was sticking to the Earth as it moved through space. He said that they used a VGL unit for this, or a variable gravity lock unit. The best that this unit could do at the time was to make sure that the machine materialized in the exact same spot on Earth that it had left from. So, once he made his trip through time, well, he would still have to travel across the country. And of course, John's superiors couldn't let John travel in a vehicle that hadn't been manufactured yet. How strange would that be? Someone driving across the country in a car from the future. So they had to put him into a car from the era that he was going to. But their choices, of course, were limited. They had already been through World War III, and most of the cars that had been manufactured before 1975 were in no condition to travel across the country. Unfortunately, the only car that they could get stood out like a sore thumb. So they mounted the time travel unit into a beautiful 1967 Chevy Corvette. And although this may seem to make the John Titor story more sexy, it most certainly could not have been the car of their choice. Much better would have been just an average car from the time that they were sending him to, one that blended well into the background. The unit itself that made time travel possible wasn't a commercial unit, so it was fairly bland. Basically, it was just an unassuming small machine that they housed in a plain black box, about 1 foot tall, 1 foot wide, and 3 foot long.
My time machine is a stationary mass, temporal displacement unit manufactured by General Electric. The unit's powered by 2 top-spin dual-positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid.
On the day of the departure, John arrived, got suited up, and prepared for launch. The departure team ran final checks on the machine. Systems were checked and double-checked, and then the green light was given. John got into the Corvette, and he set the time coordinates, and he started the countdown. The departure team stood and sat at various stations surrounding the car. Scientists and engineers monitored critical systems on their computer screens as military personnel stood by. The countdown started at 60 seconds.
59, 58, 57, 56.
And it intensified when it got to the last 10. Then, when the countdown hit 0, there was a momentary bending of space all around the car that looked like a mirror expanding and contracting. And then, John and the car blinked out of existence. The departure team in 2036 watched as space bent all around the Corvette and then pulled it into the past, leaving an empty space where it had just been. But John, inside the car, had a very different experience.
The unit has a ramp-up time after the destination coordinates are fed into the computers. An audible alarm and a small light start a short countdown, at which point you should be secured in a seat. The gravity field generated by the unit overtakes you very quickly. You feel a tug toward the unit, similar to rising quickly in an elevator, and it continues to rise based on the power settings the unit is working under. At 100%, the power, the constant pull of the gravity can be as high as 2 Gs or more, depending on how close you are to the unit. There's no serious side effects, but I try to avoid eating before flight. No bright flash of light is seen. Outside the vehicle, it appears to accelerate as the light is bent around it. We have to wear sunglasses or close our eyes as this happens due to short bursts of ultraviolet radiation. Personally, I think it looks like driving under a rainbow. After that, it appears to fade to black and remains totally black until the unit's turned off. We're advised to keep the windows closed as a great deal of heat builds up outside the car. The gravity field also traps a small pocket of air around the car and acts as your only O2 supply, unless you bring compressed air with you. The pocket only lasts for a short period, and the carbon sensors tell us when it's too dangerous. The C204 unit is accurate from like 50 to 60 years a jump, and it travels about 10 years an hour at 100%. You do hear a slight hum as the unit operates, and when the power changes or the unit turns off, there's a great deal of electrical cracking noise from static electricity.
The Corvette materialized in 1975 in the exact location that it had left from, only now it was 61 years into the past. The exact time of arrival had been carefully calculated and chosen as to minimize the possibility of anyone witnessing a car popping in from out of nowhere. Once John arrived, he immediately headed for Rochester, Minnesota. The drive was uneventful, and he was very careful to minimize his interactions with the past. During his training, he learned that every interaction, no matter how small, has an impact on time and changes the future from its original path to something different. Of course, in order to get the IBM 5100, John would have to interact with his grandfather. So when he got to Rochester, he located his grandfather, and then he waited. And when the time was right and his grandfather was alone, he made contact.
When I approached my grandfather in 1975, it took me a while to convince him I was who I said I was. He'd said something I never forgot, and I've heard some of y'all allude to it also. After looking at the unit, he turned to me and he said, either you've escaped from a sane asylum or you're a time traveler. As the weeks went on, it occurred to me that both were just as threatening and dangerous to him, and I'm not sure he ever decided which one was worse.
Once John convinced his grandfather that he indeed was the person who he said he was, and that the future truly was in danger and needed the 5100 to solve the problem, his grandfather agreed to help. But he also made a very strange request. He asked John to stop in around the year 2000 and visit his family. Now, John's posts about this request are very vague, so we can only speculate as to why he made this request. But there are some people out there who surmise that during their conversations, in order to gain his grandfather's belief, John would have had to have told him some things about the future. So he probably told him about the coming disasters, the Civil War, the World War. And his grandfather most likely did not like such a dark future for his offspring. So it's thought that this is the reason that he asked John to stop in and see his family and his younger self just before everything went south. The speculation is that once John stopped in and saw his family, spent some time with them, saw little John just before everything took that terrible turn for the worse, well, maybe John would become emotionally attached, and then perhaps he would want to help to create a new timeline for his family and his younger self, one where civil war never happens and nuclear bombs don't destroy the planet. But as I said, we really don't know why John's grandfather made this request. In any case, John promised that he would make that stop, and then he took the computer and he left for the future. John kept his promise, and he arrived in the year 2000, sometime before October 14th, because that was the day that John Teeter made his very first post to the world. Now, for those of you who know the John Teeter story, you may think that we missed something, because, well, John Teeter sent those 2 faxes to Art Bell in 1998. But for John, that hadn't happened yet, and people sometimes get confused at this part. See, John first went to the year 2000, and he stayed there until March of 2001, and then he went back to 1998, and he sent those 2 faxes to Art Bell. In those 2 faxes, he talks about this foreboding and mysterious anomaly in the year 2564, where everything just blinks out of existence. It's kind of creepy, actually. He says that many people believe that something happened in or around the year 2000 that creates a domino effect that completely ends reality as we know it in 2564. But he also talks about the attachments that he's made in and around the year 2000. And he says that it's because of those attachments that he's reaching out to Art Bell in an attempt to possibly help us change our future.
I've been on this world line since April of this year, and I plan to leave soon. Typically, time travelers do not purposefully affect the world lines they visit. However, this mission is unusually long, and I've grown attached to some of the people that I've met here. Anyway, for my own reasons, I've decided to help out the world line by sharing information about the future with a few people in the hope that it'll help their future. I'm contacting you for the same reason.
Perhaps this is what his grandfather was hoping for him to remember the love, get emotionally attached, and then decide to help our world line. Many people believe that because of his actions back in 1998, we avoided Y2K, Civil War, World War, and many other disasters that we were surely heading for. About John Teeter, in my open, I said that a lot of people think that the story has been debunked. One of the biggest reasons is that most of John Teeter's statements about the future never came true. Y2K wasn't a disaster, there was no civil war, and the world was not nuked. But this argument really just defeats itself, because John said that he was trying to change our world line. So if John Teeter were real, well, then the fact that these things never took place isn't evidence against him as much as it's evidence that he actually succeeded. Another strong argument that people make is that a man named Joseph Matheny, the creator of an online game called Ong's Hat, came forward and he claimed that he and 3 of his associates created the John Teeter posts. He said they wanted to see if they could make an internet myth. Many people point to this and they say, boom, case closed. Someone took credit for it. But can't anyone take credit for anything? Does that mean that the person actually did the thing they're trying to take credit for? Since the time that he came forward and made that claim, he's never produced one shred of convincing evidence that he actually did create John Titor. There are other arguments that people make against John Titor being a true story, but a careful look into each one shows that they all have similar holes. Now, I'm not saying that John Titor really existed. I'm just saying that the arguments against him are not as solid as people make them out to be. I think that ultimately, people just believe that something like that just can't happen, so they look for reasons why it's impossible. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that he didn't exist either. I'm not sharing my opinion one way or the other. Now, for the truly exciting part, Amy sat down with me earlier and she shared some information about John Titor that blew my mind, truly, and I know you're going to find it extremely interesting. So, let's go to that clip. So you know me, I get overly excited. I'm going to try to stay calm. So here we are in our brand new set. Are you excited about the new way that you're going to be sharing some of this deeper research that you find in these reports?
I am excited about the new set, but more so the growth of the channel. But honestly, you know me, I'm a nerd and I just like the research, so I'd share this from the closet.
Fair enough. So, I'm excited. What exactly are you going to be sharing with us this time?
Okay, so while reading through the hundreds of posts by John Titor, I came across his entry about the 1967 Chevy that he was sent back in time in. And I wanted to be thorough, so I took a journey down the rabbit hole to find out what was going on with this car. And I found some very interesting information.
Please, do tell.
Okay, for the most part, car experts agree the photo that John Titor shared of the 1967 is a Corvette with modifications. That makes sense, right? To my knowledge, the 67 Corvette didn't come standard with a time distortion unit.
Funny.
Thanks. Anyhow, in the book, Conviction of a Time Traveler, the author suggests that if John Titor's story is true, then there should be two identical Corvettes on our world line.
Oh, wow. That's right. So, but if there were, well, how would one really know that it truly was the same car? Car parts change on cars all the time.
Good point. Each car, though, is given a unique serial number, and it's called a VIN. Kind of a social security number, but for cars, a fingerprint, if you will. If John Titor sold his 67 Vet, as he said he did in the forum posts, then theoretically, there would be two 67 Corvettes with the same VIN number on our world line.
Right. That's right. So, let me guess. You found a second Corvette with the same VIN.
Well, I just might have. During my research, I came across a website called the John Titor Research Project. And in it, the author shares how, in 2018, a man named Robert Bonanno was showing his 1967 Corvette at a car show in Florida. And the value of the car was more than $250,000. Unfortunately, he discovered that there was another 1967 Corvette with that exact same VIN number, and that would greatly reduce the value of his car. So he hired a lawyer.
Wow. So wait a minute. That's insane already. There's two 1967 Corvettes with the same VIN number and in Florida even.
Yes, but there's more. In a statement by vintage car law specialist Brian Shook, he said, quote, We believe the present owner of the cloned vehicle, he or she is an innocent bystander.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I keep interrupting. He actually said cloned? No way.
Yeah. And he also said, and I quote, "The car was created many years ago, probably 20 years ago."
20. So this just keeps getting better and better. So 2018, that's when this information came to light, right? And 20 years before that, that would mean that the car was cloned in 1998.
Exactly.
98 was when Art Bell received that fax.
Right.
That's amazing. So, is this true then? Are there really two 67 Corvettes out there with the same VIN?
I don't know. You know how limited our time is. As soon as I finish one report, I have to start researching the next. I wasn't able to dive super deep into this, but I will leave a link to the information in the description below.
Cool. I love the information that you bring to these reports. Thank you.
Sure.
So, now that you know the full story of John Teeter, what do you think? Was he a time traveler from the future? Or was he just one big hoax? You know, imagining John Teeter driving across the country in that beautiful Corvette reminds me of the case of Layla Bryan. She was a woman who disappeared with her 4-year-old daughter in 1941. Just like John Teeter driving that Corvette across the country, she was driving a beautiful 1935 turtleback-style Ford when she vanished. Then, nearly 30 years later, two men saw what appeared to be the exact same car being driven by Layla Bryan. And check this out. Her 4-year-old daughter was standing on the seat beside her, and she hadn't aged a day. It is an interesting and actually a very chilling tale. We did a complete report on it. Unfortunately, however, when we did our report, we had just purchased a brand new microphone. This microphone, actually. And we didn't realize that when we recorded it, we only did so through the left channel. The tech-savvy giants that we are. If one wears headphones, it is a bit annoying to listen to. But if you don't wear headphones, then it's just like any one of our other reports. If you'd like to see this report, it's here.
Alrighty. So, I have it washed and dried. Well, it's still a little bit damp, but it's not holding its shape. And all I'm going to do is keep on using it no matter what. I mean, I can always push down the sides and do it. Let's see if it changed any on the measurement. Come on. Where's... What? I just used my measuring tape and...
Oh, it's over here.
Why is it over there?
Because the little hands got into it. I found it. I thought she'd got it from over there. She's standing over there with it.
Well, now it's 30 inches. So when I washed it, it shrank. Mama cat. Mama cat. Anyway. Let's see if I can show you how much I have left. And the shitcoin's taking over. Right here's what I've got left. But I'm not going to throw it away. I'm still going to use it. And on something else, I don't know what, but there it is. Alright, we're going to let Mama Cat lay there. Because it's a Mama Cat.